The summer sun hung low over the Montana prairie, and Samuel Hayes stood beside his weathered wooden cart, watching the dust settle from the road behind him. And he was a man of 63 years, with hands that told stories of hard work, and a face, lined by sun and wind and countless seasons on this land. His horse stood patient nearby, and the golden field stretched endlessly in every direction. And Samuel had seen many things in his years as a rancher, but nothing had quite prepared him for what he found that afternoon along the old county road. She lay there in the cart where he'd placed her so carefully, and her name was Margaret, and she had told him that much before the pain took her voice away, and her dress was torn and stained, and there was blood, and he could see she was hurt badly, and the nearest doctor was 20 miles away in town. "I beg you," she whispered, and her voice was so faint he had to lean close to hear, and "it hurts so bad." Samuel froze and his heart clenched in his chest, and he had delivered calves and set broken bones on animals, and he had seen suffering before. But this was different, and this was a human soul in agony. And for a moment he didn't know what to do. Then he said softly, "It'll be quick," and his voice was gentle, like he was talking to a frightened animal, and he wasn't sure what he meant by those words, but they came from somewhere deep inside him, and somewhere that knew about mercy. But Margaret looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and hope, and she whispered, "Please don't leave me." And Samuel understood then what she really needed, and it wasn't quick relief or false promises, and it was presence, and it was someone to sit with her in this terrible moment and not turn away. So he climbed up into the cart beside her, and he took off his worn denim jacket and folded it gently under her head, and "I'm right here," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." The afternoon light painted everything gold and the same color as the wheat that grew in Samuel's north field, and the field where he'd proposed to his wife Catherine 40 years ago. And Catherine had passed on 3 winters back, and he still felt her absence like a hollow place in his chest. "What happened to you?" Samuel asked quietly, and not because he needed to know, but because sometimes talking helped, and sometimes it kept the darkness at bay. Margaret's breathing was shallow, and she closed her eyes, and "My husband," she said, and the words came, slow and painful, and he wasn't always like this, and there was a time when he was kind. Samuel nodded, and he had known men who turned cruel, and men who let whiskey and anger poison what was good in them. "And you got people nearby?" he asked, "and family who can help?" She shook her head slightly, and "My sister lives back east in Connecticut, and we haven't spoken in 5 years, and tears slid down her temples into her hair, and I don't even know if she'd want to hear from me. People carry grudges," Samuel said, but they also carry love, and sometimes the love is just buried under hurt and pride." And he thought about his own brother Thomas, who he hadn't spoken to in a decade over a dispute about their father's land, and a dispute that seemed so small now and so meaningless. The horse nickered softly, and Samuel glanced over, and the animal stood with its head lowered and patient and waiting. And Samuel had raised that horse from a foal and taught it gentleness and trust. "Have some water," Samuel said, and he reached for his canteen, and he lifted Margaret's head carefully and helped her take small sips, and the water dribbled down her chin, and he wiped it away with his handkerchief, and the one Catherine had embroidered, with his initials back when they were young. "Thank you," Margaret breathed, and her eyes met his and held, and "You don't even know me." "Doesn't matter," Samuel said simply. "And you're hurting, and I'm here, and that's enough." They sat together as the sun moved lower, and Samuel told her about his ranch and about the cattle he raised and the vegetable garden that never quite produced the tomatoes Catherine used to grow. And he talked about small things and gentle things, and he kept his voice steady and calm. Margaret listened, and sometimes she closed her eyes, and Samuel couldn't tell if she was sleeping or just resting. But then she would open them again and look at him with gratitude. "I made so many mistakes," she said suddenly, and her voice stronger for a moment, "and I stayed when I should have left, and I believed promises that were already broken." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and he watched a hawk circle overhead, and its wings spread wide against the darkening blue. "And we all make mistakes," he finally said, "and every one of us, and the question isn't whether we made them, but whether we learn and whether we forgive ourselves." "How do you forgive yourself?" Margaret asked, and the question hung in the air between them. Samuel thought about the son he'd lost and the boy who had wanted to be a musician instead of a rancher, and Samuel had been hard on him and too hard, and the boy had left at 18, and they'd exchanged maybe a dozen words in the 15. Years before the cancer took him, and Samuel had never said he was sorry and never said he was proud. "I don't know if you ever do completely," Samuel admitted, and his voice rough with old grief, but you try, and you wake up each day and you try to be a little better and a little kinder, and you hope that's enough. Margaret reached out, and her hand found his, and her fingers were cold, and he wrapped both his hands around hers, trying to share his warmth. "Tell me about your wife," she said, and Samuel smiled, and it was the first real smile in a long time. "And Catherine," he said, "and she was small but mighty, and she could outwork any man on the ranch, and she made the best apple pie you ever tasted, and she laughed at my terrible jokes, and she never once made me feel small." He paused and swallowed hard, and she used to say that kindness was the only thing that mattered in the end, and that you could have all the money and all the land, but if you didn't have kindness in your heart, you had nothing at all. "She sounds wonderful," Margaret whispered. "She was," Samuel said, and I miss her every single day, but I try to live the way she taught me, and I try to be the kind of man she believed I could be." The shadows grew longer, and Samuel knew he needed to make a decision, and he needed to get Margaret to the doctor, or at least try. But when he suggested moving her, she cried out in pain, and he saw that it was worse than he'd thought. "I don't think I'm going to make it," Margaret said, and her voice was calm now and resigned, and I can feel it. Samuel wanted to argue and wanted to tell her she'd be fine, but he'd been around death enough to recognize its approach, and he saw it in her eyes and in the way her breathing had changed. "Then I'll stay right here with you," he said, "and for as long as you need." They sat together as the first stars appeared, and Samuel pointed out constellations and told her the stories his grandfather had told him about the sky and about how the stars were really the campfires of ancestors watching over them. Margaret squeezed his hand weakly, and "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," Samuel said, "and that's natural, and that's okay." And he thought about Catherine's last days and how she'd been scared too, but she'd faced it with courage, but you're not alone, and that counts for something. "Will you tell me about the good things?" Margaret asked, "and about the beautiful things you've seen?" So Samuel talked, and he told her about the morning he'd watched twin foals being born in the spring meadow, and about the time he'd seen the northern lights dance green and purple across the winter sky, and he told her about the day Catherine said yes to his proposal, and how her face had glowed with joy. He told her about the first snow each year, and how it made everything clean and new, and about the sound of rain on the barn roof, and about the smell of hay and horses, and about the way coffee tasted on cold mornings. Margaret's breathing grew more shallow, but she smiled, and "It sounds like a good life," she said. "It has been," Samuel agreed, "and not perfect, but good and full of moments worth remembering." "I wish I'd had more time," Margaret said, and her voice was fading now, and "I wish I'd been braver." "You're brave now," Samuel told her, "and you're facing this and you're not running from it, and that takes more courage than anything." The night air grew cool, and Samuel pulled a blanket from the cart and covered Margaret gently, and he stayed close and kept holding her hand, and he hummed old songs his mother used to sing and lullabies from another time. "Thank you for stopping," Margaret whispered, and her eyes were closed now, and "Thank you for not leaving me alone." "It was my honor," Samuel said, and he meant it and truly meant it. Margaret took a few more breaths, and each one smaller than the last, and then she was still and peaceful, and Samuel sat with her for a long time after, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the night was quiet except for the sound of wind through grass. He thought about Catherine, and about mercy, and about the ways we meet each other in moments of need, and he thought about how sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply stay and simply be present and not look away from suffering. Eventually, he climbed down from the cart and he led his horse slowly toward town and toward the sheriff and the undertaker and toward the business of death that follows dying, but he carried something with him too, and a sense that he'd done what Catherine would have wanted, and that he'd honored her memory by showing kindness to a stranger, and by sitting with someone in their darkest hour. 2 days later, Samuel stood at Margaret's funeral, and there were only a handful of people there, and the preacher and the undertaker and a few townspeople who barely knew her. And Samuel had paid for everything, and the coffin and the plot and the